On December 26, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, marking the end of one of history's most powerful empires. The Cold War was over. The world had changed forever. But what if that flag had never come down? What if the Soviet Union had survived the crisis of the early 1990s and continued into the 21st century? Today, we're exploring an alternate timeline where the USSR still exists in 2025. To understand how the Soviet Union could have survived, we need to look at why it collapsed in the first place. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was stagnating. Central planning couldn't keep up with technological innovation. Consumer goods were scarce. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources and morale. When Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, he hoped to save the system. Instead, he unleashed forces that tore it apart. The failed coup attempt in August 1991 accelerated the collapse. Hardliners tried to overthrow Gorbachev, but Boris Yeltsin and reformers defeated them. This emboldened independence movements across the Soviet republics. By December, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia itself declared the Soviet Union dissolved. But what if things had gone differently? What if Gorbachev's reforms had been more successful? What if the hardline coup had succeeded, or never happened at all? Let's explore this fascinating alternate reality. In this timeline, Gorbachev takes a different approach to reform. Instead of unleashing rapid political liberalization that destabilized the system, he focuses first on careful economic modernization, learning from China's model. Special economic zones are created. Limited private enterprises allowed while maintaining overall state control. The transition is gradual rather than chaotic. The coup attempt in August 1991 either never happens because hardliners see reforms working, or it happens but is handled differently, leading to a compromise between reformers and conservatives. The key point is that the Soviet Union holds together through this critical period. By the mid-1990s, the reformed Soviet Union has transitioned to something like socialism with Soviet characteristics, a mixed economy where state enterprises compete with private businesses, all under Communist Party oversight. It's authoritarian, but less totalitarian than Stalin's era. Think modern China, but European. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and Central Asian republics remain part of the Union, though with greater autonomy than before. The Federation is restructured to give republics more control over local affairs, while Moscow maintains authority over foreign policy, defense, and overall economic direction. Here's where global politics gets really interesting. With the Soviet Union surviving, the Cold War never truly ends, it just evolves. Instead of American unipolarity dominating the 1990s and 2000s, we have continued superpower rivalry. The end of history that Francis Fukuyama predicted never arrives. NATO doesn't expand eastward because the Soviet Union still occupies those territories. There's no need for former Warsaw Pact countries to seek Western protection. They're still under Soviet influence. The European Union develops differently, perhaps more slowly, without the influx of Eastern European members. The War on Terror unfolds completely differently. The Soviet Union, still controlling Central Asian republics with Muslim populations, has its own interests in combating Islamic extremism. After 9/11, the US and USSR might actually cooperate against al-Qaeda and the Taliban, creating a strange alliance against a common threat. The Iraq War of 2003 probably doesn't happen. The Soviet Union would oppose American intervention, and the US wouldn't risk a major confrontation. Saddam Hussein might still be in power, or regime change happens through different means. Before we continue exploring this alternate present, if you're enjoying this deep dive into alternate history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We create these mind-bending scenarios every week. And drop a comment below. Would you want to live in a world where the Soviet Union never fell? Let's keep going. The global economy looks dramatically different. Without the transition chaos that devastated Russia and other Soviet republics in the 1990s, the Soviet economy is larger and more integrated. Instead of oligarchs buying up state assets for pennies and moving wealth offshore, economic reform is more controlled. However, the Soviet Union still lags behind the West technologically. Central planning, even reformed central planning, struggles with innovation. The internet exists but is more restricted and state-controlled, similar to China's Great Firewall today. Silicon Valley still dominates tech innovation because free market dynamism produces better results than planned economies.
Power
Energy politics
comes
are
from
fascinating
control
in this
of
timeline.
essentials.
The Soviet Union controls vast oil and gas reserves in Russia and Central Asia. Europe remains heavily dependent on Soviet energy, giving Moscow enormous leverage. This makes European foreign policy much more cautious towards Soviet interests. The 2008 financial crisis still happens, but Soviet state-controlled banks are somewhat insulated from Western financial contagion. The USSR uses the crisis to criticize capitalism and promote its mixed economy model as more stable. One of the biggest questions is nuclear weapons. With the Soviet Union intact, there's no messy transition where thousands of nuclear warheads are scattered across newly independent states. The USSR maintains its massive nuclear arsenal, and the US keeps its own. Strategic arms reduction continues, but more slowly. The risk of nuclear terrorism is actually lower in this timeline. Soviet nuclear security remains intact under centralized control, rather than potentially vulnerable during the chaotic 1990s dissolution. However, the overall risk of great power nuclear confrontation remains higher because two superpowers still face off. Space exploration is more competitive. Instead of Russia's struggling space program, the full resources of the Soviet Union maintain robust space activities. The International Space Station might never exist because cooperation is limited. Instead, we have competing Soviet and American Western space stations. The new space race to return to the moon and reach Mars is primarily a US-Soviet competition. Technology and culture in 2025 are noticeably different in Soviet territories. The internet is widespread but controlled. Social media exists but is monitored. Dissent is managed through sophisticated surveillance rather than gulags. Think modern authoritarian states with 21st century technology. However, isolation is impossible in the digital age. Even with controls, Soviet citizens are exposed to Western culture and ideas. This creates constant tension between the old guard wanting to maintain communist ideology and younger generations wanting more freedom and consumer choices. Life in the Soviet Union today varies dramatically by location. Moscow and Leningrad are relatively modern cities with creature comforts, though still behind Western capitals. Consumer goods are more available than in the old Soviet days, but quality and selection lag behind the West. Central Asian republics remain economically dependent on the center, though resentment simmers among populations wanting independence. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, are the most restive. They remember independence briefly achieved before Soviet reconsolidation and push constantly for more autonomy. This creates ongoing tension within the Union. Ukraine is perhaps the most interesting case. In our timeline, Ukraine became independent and eventually moved toward Europe, leading to conflict with Russia. In this timeline, Ukraine is still part of the USSR, though Ukrainian nationalism remains strong. The government balances repression and accommodation, giving Ukraine substantial autonomy while preventing full independence. Now let's think about the present day, 2025, in this alternate timeline. Vladimir Putin might not be the leader of the Soviet Union. The political system evolved differently. Perhaps a reformed Communist Party allowed for more genuine internal elections, producing different leadership. Or perhaps the system remained more rigid, and party bureaucrats still dominate. The Soviet Union faces significant challenges. Economic inequality has grown despite socialist rhetoric. Corruption is endemic. Environmental problems from decades of industrial pollution are severe. Nationalist movements in various republics continue demanding more freedom. But the system survives because it learned to adapt. It's not your grandfather's Soviet Union. It's an authoritarian state with market elements, sophisticated propaganda, and enough economic performance to maintain legitimacy. It's powerful enough to resist Western pressure, but not powerful enough to dominate globally. The world in 2025 is more divided, more tense, but perhaps more stable in some ways. Two superpowers balancing each other prevents either from acting unilaterally. But proxy conflicts continue in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. The threat of superpower confrontation always looms. Climate change, is actually worse in this timeline. Continued superpower rivalry means less international cooperation on environmental issues. Both the US and USSR prioritize economic and military competition over climate action. The Paris Agreement either never happens or is much weaker. So would this world be better or worse? That's complicated. The chaotic 1990s that devastated lives across former Soviet territories never happened, sparing millions from economic collapse. But hundreds of millions live under authoritarianism who, in our timeline, gained freedom. The world is more stable in some ways, but more dangerous in others. Technology might be slightly behind our timeline due to less open innovation, but great power space competition could have produced some advances. Overall, it's a world that's similar, enough to recognize, but different enough to feel alien. The survival of the Soviet Union reminds us that history isn't inevitable. The collapse seemed predestined afterward, but it was the result of specific decisions and circumstances. With different choices, the hammer and sickle might still fly over the Kremlin today. What do you think? Would you want to live in a world where the Soviet Union never fell? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this alternate timeline, check out our video on What If the Cold War Turned Hot? Link in the description. Don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating historical what-ifs, and I'll see you in the next video.